In this lesson, we're going to be talking about layout grids in jQuery Mobile. Now, typically you would use layout grids when you want to divide the screen into multiple segments. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we would do this. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more text to this paragraph element, and I'm going to copy and paste this paragraph element a couple times. If we refresh, this is what it looks like. We have 3 paragraph elements on top of each other. Now, if we want these paragraph elements to be side by side, split equally into thirds, that's a situation that would call for the use of layout grids. So let's start simple, and we'll use a layout grid that divides it into halves. Here's the markup for it. Create a new div, and we give it a class of UI grid A. Now, this is telling jQuery Mobile that we have 3 elements inside which we want to be equally spaced. Now, in addition to that, we need to add a class to all of these elements inside. Just for cleanness, I'm going to use divs here. Class equals UI block A. Take that, we'll paste it for all of these, and of course we need to make sure we close our divs at the end. Now, we only wanted 2 of these, so I'm going to delete this third one. Additionally, we want to name this one UI block A because it's the first element, and we want to name this one UI block B. I'll go ahead and save that. Refresh over here, and now indeed we have the page divided up into halves. And as we resize it, we can see those halves resize properly as well. Now, of course, we don't have any additional padding on these elements, and if we inspect element, we can actually see that visually. Here's our div, and here's our paragraph element. Now, I'm not going to go into how you can do the styling other than to say you can add a custom class to these elements and then style that custom class by adding some padding on the elements inside. Additionally, you could take these elements inside and you could wrap those elements with another div of your own and give that some padding. That latter option is probably the better one because that means you're not fighting jQuery Mobile's CSS. One other thing to keep in mind is that these different areas on the left and on the right only have height because there's stuff inside of them. Later on, when we learn to stack these into a grid, you're going to want to make sure you specify a custom height for these. Now, if I want to make this have 3 columns, I change this to UI grid B. So A is for 2 columns, B is for 3 columns. You can guess C is for 4 columns, D is for 5 columns. But I'm going to set it to B to give me 3 columns. Additionally, I'm going to need to duplicate this guy here. And I don't want to forget to rename this guy to UI block C. He needs that special class in order for this to all work. If I go back here and refresh, now we've got 3 areas and they're all equally spaced. Now, I've shown you examples with 2 columns and with 3 columns. You can go up to 5 columns, but we don't actually have the capability of using jQuery Mobile's grid system for anything greater than 5 columns. If you'd like to, you can create your own or you can extend it by taking a look at their CSS file. But given that we're generally developing for mobile, typically you don't really want to have more than 5 columns because otherwise things get a little bit too thin. Now, if we want to make a grid out of these, what we can actually do is just duplicate these 3 and put them below. And you'll notice this alternating pattern, A, B, C, A, B, C. If I save this, go over and refresh, you can see that indeed everything stacks very, very nicely. Now, in order for this to work, it really is imperative that you use UI block A, B, C, and then you loop back to the beginning and say A, B, C again. Also, as I previously mentioned, you want to make sure that these all have the same height. Otherwise, the way these all float is actually going to break. For example, if I take any of these guys and I make them longer, I can't necessarily predict how this system is going to react. Everything will generally be a lot cleaner if all 3 of these have a custom height set. Now let's take a look at how this grid system can be useful in other ways. Down here we have 2 buttons. If we go down and we want to put these buttons into a grid, so that way they stretch out 50-50 across the entire footer, that's actually fairly easy to do. First off, we want to make sure that these buttons are not data inline. We want them to stretch out across their parent container. Second, we need to make the div that's going to house our grid. And third, we want to put some divs in here to wrap the buttons. We want to remember to name the second one B instead of A. Also, this should be A up here, because A represents a grid that's divided out 50-50, and B, you may recall, represents a grid that's divided out 33% for all 3 of them. Lastly, I want to make sure I close my divs here at the end. I'll save that, I'll go back over here, and I'll refresh, and I should have, indeed, 2 buttons that stretch out across the footer. And of course, if I want to duplicate these and make it 4 across, that's fairly easy to do. I want to make sure I continue that pattern with C and D, and up here I want to make sure I don't use A or B. B represents 3 across. C represents 4 across. Save that, go back, refresh, and now indeed we have 4 buttons that stretch across. So that's how you use grids in jQuery Mobile.